Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Dominic Perler's Chapter 28, Skepticism, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
All right, my friend, I have the honor of talking with you today, finishing up our chapter on skepticism, and it's been a very important chapter. Skepticism and certainty, which represents two of the chapters you and I have talked about in recent weeks, are some of the most important topics in the science of epistemology. The idea of what is truth, what is false, how could we know, and how can we be certain? And so we've talked about some very interesting medieval models, and I really enjoyed examining the model from Henry of Ghent last time. That was really very close to where I would say I'm at, this eternal model that's built on this Augustinian foundation, Platonic Augustinian, if you will, and where it is God who is the substrate by which the events that happen in reality, the knowledge of them, is linked back into our minds. And having said that, I don't know that the model's perfect. I think it's a great first start. And I think it's also a great stake in the ground to start asking about further refinements and further situations. And in the case of people who would reject that model, further discussions as to why that might be. Of course, he's not the only philosopher talking about this. And I think that's what we're going to probably finish up with today. But how are we at this point, and how would you kick things off today with thinking about some of the things that we've talked about here?
Yeah, to some extent, going back a little bit, it is interesting. We spent some time talking about Henry of Ghent, and then now we look at some of these other thinkers, Occam, Chatton, Peter Piley, and there's some others that come following. And what is interesting to me, and I think really useful, is that even where we may have some concerns about where the way they're thinking about things is heading, there is always this sense of they're trying to figure out the world in the light of who is God and how does God play into this. And that is, it is very refreshing, and it's very different than what you get in modern philosophy, where we've gotten so away from the idea of a God who is transcendent but also personal. And these medieval thinkers, their conceptions of God may vary a little bit, and exactly how God acts through us may vary a little bit, but there is always this sense of that God is a piece of and needs to be accounted for in how they're thinking about things, and often is the, not just a piece, but is the key substrate or key thing that we need to understand in order to understand humans. And as we move forward into some of these other thinkers, even where there are some differences, it's really neat to see how there is a real tie between theology and philosophy here. And there isn't this total divorce and separation of the two as we sometimes get in modern philosophy.
Amen. And because I say it almost with every new chapter, and this is not an accident. I love to jokingly say this chapter is the most important chapter, or this chapter is my favorite chapter. And in the heat of the devoted moment, I can say that with a straight face. I think I'm a very promiscuous lover when it comes to reading text. The one I'm reading now is almost always my favorite. And if text ever felt that I was being unfaithful to them by finding such a pleasure and passion in another text, I think I'd be in trouble. Having said that, this next section, and I know Chuck's already saying in his mind, oh, Brock, you're going to say this is the most important section here. I'm going to say not the exact opposite, but I'm going to say something very different. And that is, this is one of the most concerning sections to me in the theological philosophical corpus. And it's probably the main reason why I am so concerned with where philosophy and even some theological accounts will go. And it's the prime concern with the topic of skepticism. and that is how to differentiate skepticism from just outright unbelief. Now, I'm not trying to say that we can hold caricatures of the naive, gullible, unquestioning fool, and that's the only right way to do theology. But at the same point in time, this is a very disturbing section for me theologically. And let me just share the one particular sentence that really illustrates this. On page 387, there is this train of thought that says God is free to do whatever he likes. Thus, God could cause a mental state in me that presents a blossoming tree, even though there is no tree in front of me. This possibility gives rise to a serious worry. How can I ever be certain that my mental states present real things and that I have knowledge of a real world? And here's the kicker: if God can manipulate me at any time. Wow, that's a mic drop. I think even considering the question is a tacit frame of unbelief. Not because we can't ask philosophical questions like this, but because the human animal performs theological and philosophical inquiry not from a neutral position, but often from a position of self interest or even perhaps an antagonism towards the things of God. So the Bible shares with us that we as people are not simply quote unquote good, but rather because of the fall into sin, we have a desire that is turned toward and bent toward a state of warfare against God. And so now, from this state of warfare, comes this supposedly neutral and abstract question: gee, what if God is manipulating me? And so this introduces an idea of autonomy, of an idea that I need to verify and validate or justify the statements and position that God shares with me. Otherwise, I might not have knowledge, or I might not have genuine knowledge, or my knowledge that I have from the scriptures might be nothing other than belief, or worse. And I've heard non believers make the accusations: what if the God who wrote your Bible is merely deceiving you? And I've even heard some people say, what if the Bible is not a product of God, but is rather a product from the devil, meant to deceive you? So the stakes are pretty high on this topic. And I think my situation here is that I want to push back and challenge the skeptic. Are we really asking a skeptical question, or are we pushing an agenda towards unbelief? And I feel like that's fair. So this section got really dark for me very quickly, Chuck, because of that. And so as a result of that, I might have to say that this might in fact be my least favorite section in the entire book that we've read so far, because of the tendency towards that particular error or sin. Let's come out and put the stakes where they are. And so that's quite a big leap. But did you see some of that when you were reading, or how did it come to you when you were going through this section? And what do you think about some of these issues?
Yeah, no, I agree that there's something here that is rather concerning. Now, one of the interesting pieces of that relates to the fact that there is a difference between asking a question, what if God is deceiving me, or what if what God is placing in our mind doesn't reflect what's actually physically in the world, and not even be able to or willing to ask a question like that because one doesn't even acknowledge the fact of a God. And I do think that there is qualitatively a difference, but I think you're right also to have identified that I think even in this way of thinking of things that acknowledges God, we do see a move towards a more individualistic and man-centered way of thinking about it. And as I was thinking about it, a couple of things came to mind, and they really get at the question of, if God is in fact the way, the truth, and the life, as Christ says about himself in John, then shouldn't we in some ways be equating God with the truth, and therefore some of these questions, don't necessarily make sense the way that they're presented. And so, two things that came to mind, sort of concrete examples that came to mind as I was reading this portion of the chapter. One is in that section. Hold on, just in that section where there is that image of what if God has placed something in our mind that doesn't exist in the real world, and that somehow be false. The first thing that came to my mind was many years ago when I was in my 20s. I was a member of a church in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, and we had a missionary from that church who served in West Africa, in a very Islamic area of West Africa. In fact, I don't think it was even, I think I knew what country she was in, but because I was a member of the council, but I think there was, she kept it quiet even where she was working, just out of protection for her and protection for her community of Christians. And she had pointed out that in this very Islamic area of the world, there often were people who came to Christ as a result of dreams. And what would happen is because, and actually my pastor talked about this a little bit this morning as well, we would say that's not the normal way that God works. Normally he works through a community, the fellowship of believers, the community of saints. And that's a really important part of who the Christian church is. But in the absence of that, and you do have the absence of that in many parts of the Islamic world, there is, God has to work in special means. And he did this, and this missionary would tell us when she would come back and visit that, yeah, this is happening all the time. I would get somebody who would come to my village and they would say, I hear you're a Christian. And she would say, yes, I am. And they would say, Christ came to me in a dream and told me I should come to you and ask you these things and learn more about what it means to be a Christian. And so now, so as I was reading that piece about, hey, maybe there's these things that God sort of places to us in a dream, and it doesn't reflect reality that we see in the world. No, it may actually reflect absolute truth beyond a truth that's greater than what we can see with our eyes and see empirically. And there are times when God uses that in order to point us to the truth, or in order to help us see the truth. There is a sense in which if we believe that truth is much larger than just simply physical, empirically determined fact, there may even be a necessity for a larger picture of what truth is, a more, where we need that. We need God to be able to place something in our mind in order for us to see truth. So that was one image that came to mind as I was reading this, which goes against a little bit that concern, and I think is a response in a way to that concern. The other thing is a little different, and I don't know if this was ever a thing in any of the churches you were a part of, Brock, but I remember as a kid, very often in whether it was in the church bulletin or in various places, I would read an announcement, and it would say, there was a rule that it used to be in our denomination anyway, that if you got married in the church, at least to the church wedding, to the church portion of the wedding, not necessarily to the reception, you were supposed to invite the entire church. And so you'd put a message in the bulletin saying, in 3 weeks' time, on such and such a date, DV, these two people are to be married, and you're welcome to come and watch the ceremony. Or maybe there would be an announcement that in 3 Sundays, pastors from this other place will preach for us, DV. And I remember asking, what is that, DV? And being explained to me that, in fact, I think when I first asked about it, the person I asked didn't even know the words that it actually stood for, which is Deo Volente, God willing. But it was just a way of saying, hey, if God wants it to happen, it will happen. And we're hoping that it'll happen, and we believe that it will happen. But God could turn, God could decide that this isn't going to happen for some good reason. And so we always think about everything that's going to happen in the future as being based on if God wills it, then it will happen. And so DV. And I've noticed that's disappeared. I don't see people doing that very often anymore. And I wonder, again, whether that is a function of a move away from recognizing that whatever God wills is what is good and what is true, and that doesn't necessarily reflect what we will. And that we always need to have this reminder that of God's will and of God's will being perfect and our wills not necessarily being perfect. And so again, thinking about how do we perceive things, how do we perceive truth, and can God step in and cause us to see things differently than what they quote unquote really are, reflects a non-DV view of the world. And as Christians, we should have a DV view of the world, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I think there's a maturity there in that DV. And I think this is what is so objectionable to me in principle with the inquiry turning from investigating that what happens in reality is faithfully documented in, mentally speaking, in my mind. But here's the issue. The question is, how can I ever be certain that my mental states present real things and that I have a knowledge of a real world if God can manipulate me at any time? And I would say that the preconditions behind that question are perhaps what's unwholesome. And let me explain why. First of all, the atheist, the skeptic, has to even account as for why that would be a bad thing. Where's the rightness or the wrongness of something in one's mental state corresponding accurately to reality under an atheistic view? Now, certainly in a Christian view, in a theistic worldview, we appeal to God as this underlying governor, this underlying lawgiver who has himself invested wholesomely. It's good to reflect reality as it truly is in a human mental state, because when God first created humankind, that was the nature of the faculties that he gifted to us. And God saw that it was good, Genesis chapter 1 will tell us regarding the creation. Now, if we start from this idea that there's something ethically concerning, we have to ask ourselves still, why should that be? And you mentioned it earlier, you touched upon it. What contract does God have with you, Chuck, or with me, that guarantees or makes certain or justifies our resting in the gifts that he's given us? So he's given me a pair of eyes to see. He's given me a pair of ears to hear. He's given me the sense of taste, touch, and smell. Who am I to be upset with the warranty associated with the gifts of those faculties? In other words, can I go back to God like I might go back to my car dealership and say, hey, the transmission's not working? Can I go back and complain to God and say, hey, God, my eyes are not truly revealing to me things as they really are all the time? Same thing with the other senses, the sense of smell, the sense of touch. Maybe I smell, everybody's had the situation where they smell, maybe it's baked goods. If your grandmother was like my grandmother, she loved to bake. And to this day, if I go in to somebody's house and I smell that smell associated with baking, it just brings me right back to being in the presence of my grandmother. Now, of course, that smell is in some sense manipulating me. It is deceiving me. My grandmother is not there. My grandmother has not been on this earth for 40 years now. So is God deceiving me? Is he manipulating me because I have that aspect of recall? I can remember, it can feel so real to me, like I'm in the presence of my grandma from that smell. So my point is not to argue in the affirmative there, but just to say this is really a can of worms that I think is bigger than the skeptic is willing to address or admit. One more aspect of the way this section hit me. It's no secret, Chuck, that people often take psychedelics. They often take drugs for the purposes of recreation, for the purpose of enjoyment. And one of the side effects, very frequently, with some of these drugs is that one's faculties just run off the rails. People start seeing things that aren't there. People start tripping. Things start happening. And Chuck, we've got people who do that for the pleasure of doing it. So, how then is it that we have to start this philosophical inquiry from the pejorative that if something in my mental state, which I would naively think represents something real, does not have an actual existence in the world, how can I say that God is manipulating me? How can I put myself in the position where I'm the aggrieved party and God is the offending party? I think that's really an important inquiry to go down, even if we decide at some point that this is an acceptable line of things to think about. And so this is not an easy subject to talk about, because who is making these inquiries that we should just start with such a premise, such a negative ethical starting point? Oh, hey, God could be manipulating me, so I obviously need something that's more pure, more reliable, better than the presence of God Himself in my life. And so I hope that wasn't overstated, but I almost think this is one of those issues that's hard to overstate. So, how does that hit you?